On a desolate volcanic planet, a pair of twins were racing across the barren lands. They were holding hands and quickly were being chased by something in the heat-filled mist. One of them tripped over a large reddish stone and fell face first to the ground. The other tried to help, but in doing so made the monsters come to them. They screamed in terror and were brutally killed. In a nearby shantytown, Commander Solder was radioing a platoon of fighters who were out in the open barren lands and asked if the twins were found. Nothing at first, but then one of the fighters said they found. He let off a sigh of relief but was given the bad news that they were dead and he fell back into his seat. He mumbled the word damn and then leaned onto the desk. There's a couple added to the death penalty. A woman called Frex came into his shabby metal hut and asked if the twins were recovered. Solder didn't look at her and bluntly said that twins were killed by them creatures lurking in the barren lands. Frex's response was a shock of horror. She knew the twins since they were little and looked up at the ceiling. They'll be reunited with their parents. Solder ordered the fighters to return back to base and accepted. What they didn't say over the radio was the state the twins' dead bodies were in. Ripped to shreds like fresh meat in a butcher's, and their bloodied heads were caved in with the reddish stones exposing their skulls. Frex left Solder's hut. More fighters were present. They were escorting the planet's inhabitants to a large rocket called Babel 17. They were evacuating the planet and time wasn't definitely on their side. Frex saw a child crying. She came over and reassured that where they are going will be safe. The child looked up at her and gave a slight smile. She then approached a technician called Unal who was using small traction robots to survey the barren lands if any other survivors were still around, and Unal said that the twins were the recent sightings on the monitors. The problem was that the heat and mist of the planet's atmosphere was affecting the systems. The cameras would become static and freeze, losing sight of the twins. Frex was about to leave until Unal shouted her over. One of the traction robots began to shake like some kind of earthquake, and then the sight of a box-like object appeared in the mist. Frex leaned into the monitor. What on earth can that be? The doctor opened the TARDIS and stepped out. His reaction was quite surprised. The planet he remembered wasn't the same it used to be, and looked at the barren lands. The heated mist, its reddish rock structures and sporadic pools of a bright orangey liquid. Louisa came out. She moaned that the planet's air was too hot, like they've just stepped into a planet-sized oven, and felt her blonde hair would curl due to the extreme heat. The doctor said to her that the planet Troxus 4 was a beautiful planet, but somehow it's ended up in a wasteland and seems to be on edge of destroying itself. Louisa was quite cautious when walking on the ground. It was crumbly and she felt like it would spill beneath her. She and the doctor walked a few yards when suddenly the ground beneath them began to shake and the TARDIS was dropped into the bright orangey liquid. The doctor shouted aloud no. He treaded towards where it stood and looked at the liquid. The TARDIS was gone. He wasn't sure if it would sustain this sort of damage and wondered he and Louisa will be stranded in this self-destructive planet. Then Louisa saw a little spotlight coming out of the mist and called him over. The doctor realized that it's a small traction robot. They were mainly used for mining systems and approached it. Frex and Unal looked at the doctor and Louisa on the screen. She brought out a small microphone and proceeded with contact. Her voice came through the little speakers from the traction robot's head and the doctor exchanged conversation. Frex ordered them to follow the robot and that they'll reach the nearby shantytown they are using as a base of operations. The two followed to the robot to the shantytown and the doctor was surprised at what he'd saw. Frex came over and asked if they were okay. The doctor said he lost his ship and got sunk into the pools of liquid. Frex said that liquid known as life is beyond deathly. He's heard of this stuff. Comes from the planet's core and if accidentally fall into it would disintegrate anything into nothing. Louisa looked on as the fighters were still evacuating the inhabitants into the rocket Babel 17 and asked Frex about where they were going. Frex just said they'll be drifting in space and she'd given them false promises of heading to a planet with a made-up called Buchanan. The doctor said a planet with that name exists. He didn't have positive things to say about it. A concrete and tarmac jungle. Loads of hover traffic congestion and psychotic drivers. A woman in ragged clothing came angrily to Frex. She had heard everything and tried to expose Frex for making them be a part of a suicide pact. Dying in the vacuum of space inside a half-assed constructed rocket, and Frex just froze at the response. Solder heard the commotion and reassured the woman that they'll be heading to a new home planet. Well, sort of. The woman just scowled at him and walked off. The doctor introduces himself to Solder. Solder says he used to be part of the Reagan force. He was a commander and when the plastoids started to emerge from their hides they got eliminated. He is the last of the Force still standing and helping his people as much as he can. The doctor asked, who are these plastoids? Solder said they are vicious cave creatures that don't like to be interfered in their environment, and when the planet's core started to erupt destroying everything, the plastoids started to roam the surface. During the conversation, a young family saw something leaping and crawling in the heat mist. The father then realized that the plastoids have found the evacuation site and quickly alerted Solder. Solder quickly ordered the fighters to arm up and fire at the creatures. The plastoids quickly leaped into the site, attacking people left, right and center, animalistic, ripping apart limbs and features. Frex ordered the doctor and Louisa to get into the rocket. They'll be safe in there, and she hesitantly shouted at them to go. They quickly reached the rocket Babel 17, but the doctor noticed that a few of the plastoids had crawled themselves inside. Screams were heard in the rocket and the sound bones being ripped out. The doctor told Louisa to move away and headed to the east of the site. Frex looked at the two going in a different direction and told them get inside. Suddenly the rocket Babel 17 exploded and Frex was flown a few yards forward. She landed face first and laid on her front. Solder quickly came to her aid and brought her up. They were doomed. The plastoids had killed all the fighters and the evacuees. Then a group of them surrounded them like a pack of hyenas, fighting with their cracked claws and snarling in a tetchy clicking tone. The doctor and Louisa emerged out of some loose rubble and red sand. He walked slowly to them and tried to reason with them. The plastoids just gave more snarling sounds and he given up doing that. You can't reason with cave creatures even if they are vicious bastards and would rip you apart head to toe. Suddenly a large spotlight shone from the sky and a voice boomed out. The plastoids began to slowly crawl away from Solder and Frex. The doctor looked up at a nearby spotlight and climbed up some scaffolding. He turned it on and flashed it in front of the plastoids. They were exposed in the shining light and shrieked. They fled out of the destroyed evacuation site and headed into the heated mist. Frex thanked the doctor and tried to get her bearings after the horrific aftermath of the attack. Solder had lost his people, the ones who were fighting in this battle, all gone, and thought to himself, could this be the end? The doctor walked up to him and said there is a chance of escaping this planet. Solder didn't have hope for this acceptance, but Frex did, keeping up some optimism, and then heard a slight rumble coming from the remains of Babel 17. It was Unal. He managed to survive the attack but sustained serious injuries to his legs with metal shards sticking of them. The doctor tried to tend to his wounds, but Solder, in a bizarre act of heroism, brought out a hacksaw and proceeded to amputate Unal. The doctor tried to stop him from doing it, but Solder didn't listen. He grabbed hold of a rock that seemingly held in his palm and shoved it into Unal's mouth. Solder told him to not flinch. He started sawing Unal's legs off violently. Unal screamed in agony beyond absolute. Louisa couldn't bear it and turned away. Frex held her scarf over her mouth in discomfort, and the doctor held his hand over his eyes though he spread his fingers to get a sneaky peek at the barbarism Solder was preforming. Unal suddenly died from the amputation and Frex started attacking him. Solder shoved her away and said he was only trying to save him. Frex let out a frantic response saying Solder was a phony. He took umbrage with this and threatened to attack her. The doctor quickly intervened in the raging conflict and told both of them to settle down. He then suggested to them that in order to flee this dying planet is to retrieve his ship, the TARDIS. Frex mentioned its shape that she and Unal saw. The doctor hatched a plan on the spot and said that they are going to retrieve the TARDIS from the depths of the planet. Solder realized what they were going to face and stubbornly agreed to it, only because he wanted to leave this desolate waste of a planet. The doctor, Louisa, Solder and Frex headed away from the evacuation site. They walked over the crumbling grounds of the planet and found a cave entrance. Solder and Frex weren't sure about this, mainly because they were intruding on plastoid territory. The doctor told them that he can hear the TARDIS humming and brought out the sonic screwdriver. He fiddled with it and outshone a torch-like light from its emitter. They carefully ventured in the cave. The doctor and company eventually found the TARDIS, but it was surrounded by the plastoids, circling it like it was a symbol of worship. Its loud humming sound was bringing them to it like moths to light, and the doctor pondered what to do about them. The sonic screwdriver came into the question. The doctor removed the emitter from it and proceeded to distract the plastoids by throwing it into one of the dark caverns. The plastoids do so follow it and scavenged for it. Louisa said to him if the screwdriver would work without its emitter. The doctor said he'll have to repair it and proceeded to walk to the TARDIS. The exterior was still covered in life. The doctor brought out a paisley hatband and began to unlock the doors. Louisa then heard some scuttling coming out of the caverns and she alerted him. The doctor turned his head round. He gritted his teeth and then realized that there's probably a load more in the vicinity. He only distracted a small group of them and another faction were coming in to attack. Frex brought out a laser pistol and told the doctor she'll have his and Louisa's backs. Louisa asked about Solder's involvement. She and Frex looked around. Solder had disappeared. Frex became angry with this. He deserted them and left them to fend for themselves. Then a couple of plastoids started to emerge from the pockets of darkness and set their sights of them. Frex pointed her laser pistol at them and began to fire. The plastoids crawled frantically to try to maneuver away from the shots and then came closer to both Frex and Louisa. Frex suddenly dropped her laser pistol. It had overheated and burned her hand. The doctor was still tending to the TARDIS. He told them to stay still. Louisa shouted saying they are getting closer and they are not deadly insects trying to bite. A whistle interrupted the plastoids and Solder emerged. He threw some sharp rocks at them. Some of them impacted the plastoids' skulls, injuring them and a couple fatally wounding them. Frex shouted at him for deserting them and Solder's only reply was he seeking artillery. The doctor quickly opened up the recovered TARDIS and ordered Solder and Frex to enter in. They were unsure at first but walked in and were taken aback by how large it was inside this blue wooden box. The doctor and Louisa followed in though he never mentioned about the dimensions of his ship. He set the controls to the planet Bucharan. Frex said to him he thought the planet's atmosphere was too much for him. The doctor leaned over the console and said it was the name that she suggested, the ones who were willing to escape but never had the chance to, and that white lie somehow became true in a sort of optimistic way. Frex understood this while Solder just sat in the chair beside the console. The doctor just looked at him ashamedly and muttered something like pompous know-it-all. The TARDIS lands on Bucharan. When Solder and Frex walked out, the sound of the heavy congested traffic deafened their ears. The smell of carbon monoxide was unbearable and the landscape was just tall buildings steeped high in its dark grey sky. The doctor and Louisa came out and leaned against the TARDIS doors. Frex thanked them for taking them here. Solder's only response was that the doctor just helped them evacuate Troxus 4 and nothing else. The doctor just happened to be at the right place and right time, but Solder's attitude made it feel that the doctor's intervention was more of a mere spare art in his plan to flee the planet. Louisa spoke up that the doctor had saved him and that he would have perished on that dying planet. Solder just scoffed at her. Frex then shouted him and stripped him down of his insecurities, calling him a cad, a coward and a bigot. She continued on until she gave up and walked off out of his sight. His only response was the word pity and looked at her storming off. The doctor just looked at him sternly and watched him walk off down the streets. He didn't say anything and turned back to the TARDIS. He gave one last look at him. He was shouting out for a taxi and then entered in the TARDIS, leaving him on the pavement searching for a lift. He closed the doors and proceeded to walk to the console.